I submit this record under the assumption that loyalty is still a measurable substance. I was taught it could be weighed, measured in compliance, verified through repetition of sanctioned truths. I believed this as one believes in gravity, not because it's kind, but because it is consistent. I begin this confession as I began my service, certain that clarity would emerge if I obeyed the structure laid before me. I was wrong only slowly. My designation is irrelevant now, but I was an archivist attached to a minor Ordo Xenos data sanctum, charged with reviewing cultural threat profiles related to the Drukhari. Not battlefield encounters, not raids, not casualty estimates. My task was narrower, cleaner, safer. To determine why the Drukhari torture never ends. The answer, I was assured, was simple. They are sadists, predators, degenerates gnawing at the edge of real space. Their cruelty is excess. Their suffering a byproduct of corruption. We endure. They wither. That was the approved narrative. This file exists because that explanation began to fail. The initial anomaly appeared as a clerical inconsistency, an absence, not an error. Recovered testimonies from Drukhari captives, rare as they are, displayed a recurring refusal to describe torture as an act. They spoke instead of maintenance, of continuity. One phrase appeared repeatedly across unrelated interrogations, separated by centuries and light years. It does not end because it is not meant to. At first, I dismissed this as cultural metaphor, Xenos poetry, a coping mechanism. But as I collated further records, interrogator logs, psychoresonance scans, even sensor transmissions from within Commerack, a pattern emerged that was not emotional, but structural. The Drukhari do not torture to extract information. They do not torture to punish. They do not torture to indulge. They torture to remain. This was not conjecture. It was stated plainly in a sealed doctrinal fragment recovered from a long-dead inquisitor whose name has been redacted even from this archive. His conclusion was marked heretical. Do not disseminate, yet preserved nonetheless. I will paraphrase, as the original was partially excised. The Drukhari are not sustained by pain as nourishment. Pain is not fuel. Pain is calibration. Calibration of what? I asked. The answer unfolded across centuries of suppressed data, psychoreactive architecture, temporal distortion within the webway, and the peculiar absence of warp resonance within Drukhari souls. They are not merely avoiding damnation. They are evading dissolution. The Drukhari believe, no, that identity is not fixed, that selfhood erodes, that without constant reinforcement through the suffering of others, the boundaries of the self collapse, and something worse than death occurs. They call this loss by many names, none of which translate cleanly into Low Gothic. The closest approximation is unbecoming. I remember the moment this ceased to be academic. It was during my review of a censored astropathic echo, a dying scream captured not from a victim, but from a Drukhari who had been deprived systematically of access to suffering. No torture, no spectatorship, no psychic feedback loop, just isolation. The scream was not of pain. It was of disintegration. The subject reported sensations of thinning, of memory losing sequence, of emotions detaching from experience. He did not fear death. He feared ending incorrectly. His final words, before neural collapse, were recorded as, "I am forgetting where I stop." At this stage, I reported my findings. I requested reassignment. I cited cognitive contamination risk. The response was immediate and absolute. Continue. This knowledge is already contained. Contained where, I wondered. That was when the next layer revealed itself. Internal memos, sanctioned, signed, acknowledged that Drukhari torture methods had influenced Imperial interrogation doctrine in subtle ways, not techniques, frameworks. The idea that suffering could stabilize truth, that identity fractures under pressure, revealing a more accurate self beneath. I began to recognize phrases. I began to hear echoes. What unsettled me most was not the Drukhari belief, but its resonance with our own. The Imperium also believes that the self must be broken to be reforged. That endurance proves worth. That pain clarifies loyalty. We simply call it by holier names. At this point, I still believed resistance was correct. That exposure did not equal acceptance. That understanding an enemy did not require sympathy. But the records continued, and with them, a deeper realization. The Drukhari are not perpetuating torture because they enjoy it. They do it because the alternative is annihilation without release. And if that is true, if torture is not excess, but necessity, then the question is not why the torture never ends. The question is whether it ever could. If suffering is the mechanism by which identity is preserved, then what does it mean to oppose it? And more dangerously, what does it mean if that mechanism works? I once believed that exposure to forbidden knowledge produced an immediate reaction, panic, revulsion, rejection. That is how contamination is described in the manuals. A sudden fracture, a visible break. That is not how it happened. The truth arrived as alignment. As I continued my assigned task, I noticed that my objections did not vanish. They simply became inefficient. Each time I felt resistance, it required more effort to sustain, like holding a door shut against pressure that was not violent, only patient. I began to dream in footnotes. In one recurring sequence, I stood in a vast archive whose shelves extended inward rather than upward, spiraling into a depth without bottom. Each shelf contained a single word repeated endlessly, etched into bone slivers, continue. I woke each time with the certainty that the dream was not metaphor, but rehearsal. I logged this, of course. Psychological self-reporting is mandatory. The response was delayed. When it came, it contained only one line. Dream content within acceptable deviation. Proceed. Proceed toward what? That question was answered indirectly through a newly unsealed tranche of data labeled postfall analysis, Alendrak. The name itself was treated as hazardous. Entire paragraphs were replaced with void black sigils indicating sanctioned removal. Yet what remained was enough. Alendrak was described not as a location, but as a condition, a state within the webway where the self thins beyond recovery, where identity ceases to anchor properly to sensation. The Drukhari fear it not because it is painful, but because it is silent. Silence, it seems, is the true enemy. The documents detailed how the Drukhari once sought alternatives. This surprised me. The approved Imperial stance insists that Xeno's depravity is static, incapable of reform or introspection. Yet here were records, ancient even by Eldar standards, of philosophical schisms, abandoned disciplines, entire sects that attempted abstention. They did not survive, not executed, not purged. They simply faded. Accounts describe individuals who lost the ability to recognize their own names, then their own sensations, then the distinction between memory and anticipation. They became observers of their own erosion until observation itself failed. One recovered Drukhari text, translated at extreme cost to the lex mechanica assigned, contained a line that I cannot excise from my thoughts. Pain is the proof that I am still bounded, contained, defined. This is where my certainty first cracked, because the Imperium also fears dissolution. We speak of it endlessly. Heresy, corruption, the loss of self to the warp. We construct entire civilizations around the premise that identity must be defended through ritual, discipline, and, when necessary, suffering. The difference, I told myself, is justification, purpose. We suffer for something greater. But the Drukhari believe the same. Another document followed, a redacted transcript from a conclave involving senior members of the Ordo Xenos. The discussion was not about extermination. It was about containment of ideas. One inquisitor, name sealed, posed a question that ended the meeting prematurely. If for being requires inflicted suffering to maintain identity, is preventing that suffering an act of mercy or murder? No answer was recorded. Only the meeting's termination and the subsequent execution of the scribe who transcribed it. At this point, I should have stopped. I was still capable of stopping. Instead, I requested access to comparative doctrine. I wanted to understand whether this pattern, suffering as stabilizer, appeared elsewhere. The machine spirit hesitated before granting permission, as if aware of the trajectory this inquiry implied. I reviewed records of sanctioned Imperial practices, penal legions, confession through flagellation, psycho-indoctrination protocols. I compared language. The parallels were not perfect, but they were rhyming. Repeated phrases emerged across unrelated cultures. Endurance clarifies truth. Pain strips illusion. Only through suffering does the self become real. I had read these words before without consequence. Now they rearranged themselves. The Drukhari, I began to suspect, are not an aberration. They are an extreme articulation of a principle we quietly accept, that identity is not inherent, but enforced, and enforcement requires pressure. This realization did not horrify me. That is what frightened me most. It felt logical, elegant even. If the universe is entropy, then the self must be maintained through expenditure. Pain is simply the most reliable currency. I noticed then a change in my language. My reports became less condemnatory, more analytical. I stopped using words like atrocity and replaced them with process. I justified this as professionalism, detachment. But detachment is not neutrality. It is preparation. The archive marks this section with a warning sigil indicating incipient ideological drift. I would have flagged another for the same symptoms, without hesitation. Instead, I continued, because by then, a question had taken root that I could not excise. If the Drukhari torture never ends because ending it means ceasing to exist as themselves, what does that imply about all systems that rely on suffering to define what they are? And more personally, if I feel myself becoming clearer, more coherent, the deeper I descend into this knowledge. Is that corruption? Or is it alignment? The Imperium did not react to my findings with outrage. That, more than anything, should have warned me. There were no purges, no abrupt termination orders, no accusations of heresy. Instead, there was reclassification. My work was moved laterally, never upward, never outward, into deeper annexes, narrower circles. Each transfer was accompanied by reassurances that I was valued, that my perspective was useful. Use is a dangerous word. I was instructed to review responses rather than causes. How Imperial institutions reacted when confronted, indirectly, deniably, with the Drukhari principle of suffering as continuity. These were not official acknowledgments. They were adaptations, quiet ones. One such case involved a long-abandoned penal colony whose recidivism rates had inexplicably dropped to zero, not because prisoners reformed, because they ceased to resist identity erosion. Daily cycles of controlled deprivation had been replaced with irregular, unpredictable punishments. No pattern, no end. The warden's final report stated, subjects demonstrate heightened clarity of self when pain intervals are inconsistent. Anticipation alone sustains compliance. The report was approved. Another file concerned a scola experiment, never named as such, but unmistakable in structure, where aspirants were denied not comfort, but closure. Failures were not punished immediately. They were left unresolved. The result was increased loyalty, intensified self-definition through endurance of uncertainty. I recognized the logic instantly. So did something else in me. By now, my dreams had changed. The archive shelves no longer spiraled inward. They formed a ring. At the center was nothing, but the ring held. It did not collapse. I woke each time with a sense of relief. I stopped reporting the dreams. The deviation log notes this omission. What followed was my first exposure to a document labeled Comparative Metaphysics, Drukhari/Imperial Subjectivity. It was authored by multiple hands, each section initialed, none signed. The conclusion was cautious, almost apologetic. Where chaos erodes identity through excess, the Drukhari preserve identity through precision. Where the Imperium seeks unity through doctrine, the Drukhari achieve continuity through suffering. These systems are not oppositional. They are divergent solutions to the same existential pressure. Pressure. That word again. The document did not recommend emulation. It did not recommend prohibition. It simply existed, an acknowledgement without instruction. And yet, its implications spread faster than any order could. I began to notice changes in myself that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to deny. My thoughts felt bounded, sharper, less diffuse. I experienced fewer doubts unrelated to my work. My sense of purpose intensified, even as my moral language thinned. I told myself this was discipline. But discipline, I was learning, is simply suffering with structure. A pivotal moment occurred during a sanctioned interview with a former Imperial citizen recovered from a Drukhari raid, one of the few returned alive. He was physically intact, psychologically altered, but not broken in the expected way. When asked to describe his captors, he did not speak of cruelty. He spoke of attention. "They never let me disappear," he said. "Every time I felt myself fading, they pulled me back. It hurt. Emperor, it hurt. But I was never lost." The interrogator terminated the session early. I did not. I replayed the recording until the words lost their foreignness. That night, for the first time, I wondered whether the Drukhari truly torture others, or whether they recruit unwilling participants into a system that refuses the mercy of oblivion. This thought horrified me. Then it steadied me. The deviation log notes increased latency between stimulus and emotional response. It labels this incipient normalization. I would have agreed once, but normalization implies aberration corrected. What if this was not correction, but calibration? I found myself questioning the foundational Imperial maxim: to suffer is to serve. We repeat it endlessly, but we treat it as metaphor. The Drukhari do not. They operationalize it. They refine it. They remove sentiment and leave mechanism. Is that evil? Or is it honest? The institution seemed to sense my trajectory. Access restrictions tightened. Some files vanished mid-review. Others appeared unsolicited, as if placed deliberately. I could not tell whether I was being guided or tested. Perhaps there is no difference. In my final report before this section was sealed, I wrote something that I do not remember deciding to write. The Drukhari torture never ends, because ending it would require a stable self that does not require reinforcement. Such a self may not exist. No censure followed. No approval either. Only silence and deeper access. That was when I realized the most unsettling truth so far. The Imperium was not afraid of this idea. It was curious, and so was I. There is a moment, rare, quiet, and almost always unrecorded, when a framework stops feeling imposed and begins to feel inevitable. I did not recognize that moment when it occurred. Only later did I understand that inevitability is how systems defend themselves. My reassignment placed me within a review cell tasked not with Zeno's analysis, but doctrinal resilience. The mandate was vague by design. We were to assess which ideas could be exposed without destabilizing loyalty, and which truths required burial beneath layers of ritual denial. The Drukhari material was no longer classified as Zeno's intelligence. It had become comparative philosophy. This alone should have terrified me. Instead, it clarified something that had been hovering at the edges of my awareness. The Imperium does not suppress dangerous ideas because they are false. It suppresses them because they work too well without the proper framing. Suffering, when uncontrolled, leads to despair. Suffering, when ritualized, leads to obedience. Suffering, when continuous and unresolved, leads to identity crystallization. The Drukhari simply remove the comforting lie that this process ends. I was instructed to analyze case studies involving prolonged exposure to unresolved hardship, siege populations, generational void crews, isolated shrine worlds. The conclusion repeated itself across centuries of data. Where suffering was finite, trauma dominated. Where suffering was endless but structured, meaning emerged. Meaning is more resilient than hope. This realization did not arrive as revelation, but as relief. It explained inconsistencies I had never been able to reconcile. Why some worlds collapse after brief horrors, while others endure millennia of deprivation without rebellion. Why faith hardens most effectively where comfort never existed to be lost. The Drukhari, I began to see, are not unique in their methods. They are unique in their honesty. A suppressed memorandum circulated briefly within my cell before vanishing. I memorized it instinctively, sensing its impermanence. It stated, "The Drukhari do not create suffering to control populations. They create suffering to prevent existential diffusion. Control is a side effect. Existential diffusion." I tested the phrase silently, turning it over like a blade. It described something I had felt myself resisting for years. Fear of becoming unfixed, undefined, absorbed into systems so vast that The individual dissolves without friction. Pain provides friction. This was when my internal language shifted completely. I no longer thought in terms of morality, but in terms of stability. I evaluated practices by whether they preserved coherence under pressure. The Drukhari model excelled. Too well. I noticed, with professional detachment, that my emotional responses had narrowed, not vanished, focused. I felt irritation when systems failed to apply pressure efficiently. I felt impatience with mercy that produced decay rather than growth. The integrity review flagged this as value drift. I flagged the review as methodologically biased. It passed. My dreams returned, altered again. I no longer stood in archives or rings. I stood in a corridor with no doors, only surfaces that reflected me back. Not visually, but conceptually. Each reflection was a version of myself defined by a different pressure endured. None were free. All were coherent. I woke each time with the same thought. I would rather hurt than blur. That thought did not feel alien. It felt obvious. The decisive shift occurred during a closed symposium, attendance limited, records partial, where senior doctrinal authority posed a question that silenced the chamber. If endless suffering preserves identity, is the promise of an end the most profound cruelty we inflict? No one answered directly. Instead, the discussion reframed itself around managed perpetuity, endless duty, endless vigilance, endless war, not as tragedy, but as stabilizing constant. I realized then that the Drukhari torture never ends, because ending it would introduce the very instability they fear most, the illusion of completion. Completion invites collapse. The Imperium understands this instinctively. We just refuse to articulate it so plainly. At this stage, resistance no longer felt virtuous. It felt indulgent, a luxury afforded by those not responsible for maintaining coherence at scale. I began to suspect that my earlier objections were not moral, but aesthetic. I wanted suffering to mean something else. But what if meaning is simply what suffering produces? The quarantine annotation at the end of this section notes a critical change. Subject no longer frames Drukhari practices as alien. Subject now frames them as extreme but internally consistent. Consistency is seductive. It offers rest. This is where the confession becomes difficult to separate from endorsement. I am no longer certain where observation ends and alignment begins. The records do not help. They continue to open, one after another, as if recognizing me. Or perhaps I am recognizing myself in them. There's no single moment when participation begins. That is another lie we tell ourselves, that corruption announces itself with sensation, that compromise feels like a fall. In truth, participation feels like efficiency, like friction removed from thought, like finally using the correct tool for a task you have been performing badly for years. By the time I realized I was no longer merely studying the system, I had already adjusted my behavior to suit it. The first sign was subtle. I began structuring my workdays differently, not around completion, but around continuity. Tasks were no longer meant to end cleanly. I left threads unresolved, notes intentionally incomplete, not out of negligence, but design. I found that the lingering discomfort sharpened my focus. Resolution dulled it. I told myself this was an optimization technique. The archive log records a measurable increase in output. Soon after, I was invited, never ordered, to participate in a closed exercise labeled subjective stress mapping. Participation was voluntary. That word appears 3 times in the invitation, as if repetition could make it true. The exercise did not involve physical pain. That would have been obvious, crude. Instead, it employed controlled deprivation of certainty, questions without answers, accusations without resolution, evaluations without verdicts. Days passed without feedback. Weeks. I observed myself carefully during this period, the way one might observe a specimen of interest. I did not deteriorate. I condensed. Thoughts that once wandered now looped tightly around a central axis. My sense of self did not fracture under the pressure. It hardened. I became more aware of where I ended, of what belonged to me, of what did not. When the exercise concluded without announcement, I felt an unexpected disappointment. I understood then what the Drukhari testimonies had been circling all along. Suffering does not merely preserve identity, it teaches it. This realization was recorded in my self-report. No corrective action followed. Instead, I received expanded clearance. With it came access to material I had not known existed. Internal debates, centuries old, concerning whether the Imperium's greatest vulnerability was not chaos, nor Xenos, nor rebellion, but relief. Periods of peace correlated disturbingly with doctrinal decay. Comfort bred diffusion. Diffusion bred heresy. One marginal note, written in a hand later identified as belonging to a long-dead Lord Inquisitor, read, "The self-untested will seek annihilation disguised as freedom." I could not refute this. I had felt it myself before all this. The quiet dread of meaninglessness that no creed quite addressed. The temptation to dissolve responsibility into abstraction, to be less defined. Pain had cured that. Not physical pain, though I no longer recoiled from the idea, but existential pressure. The sense that something was always at stake, that there was no final rest. I began to see the Drukhari not as tormentors, but as custodians of a terrible clarity. They had looked into the abyss of entropy and refused both surrender and false hope. They chose maintenance over mercy. This did not make them good, but it made them comprehensible. And comprehension, I was learning, is not neutral. The breach occurred when I was asked again, not ordered, to advise on an interrogation framework for a high-value internal asset. The subject was Imperial, loyal, broken, but inconsistently so. Traditional methods had failed. I suggested removing closure. No final judgment, no sentence, no absolution, only perpetual assessment. The subject would never know if compliance was sufficient, never know if confession was complete. The framework was implemented. The results were immediate. The subject stabilized. His narratives became coherent. His loyalty sharpened, not because he was freed from suffering, but because suffering became his context rather than his crisis. I felt no triumph, only recognition. This is what participation feels like, not cruelty, but correctness. The sense that something is finally functioning as intended, regardless of how it appears from the outside. That is the most dangerous sensation of all, because at this stage, resistance no longer feels like defiance. It feels like sabotage. The archive flags this section as point of no return. That assessment is incomplete. There is no return because there was no departure. I was always moving toward this understanding. The Drukhari merely articulated it without disguise. They do not ask whether torture should end. They ask what would remain if it did, and they find the answer unacceptable. As increasingly do I. There's a reason this section was buried more deeply than the rest. Not because it contains forbidden names, not because it reveals hidden locations, but because it abandons the final pretense that this record is observational. Up until now, I could still pretend I was describing them. The Drukhari, the Imperium, abstract systems, distant philosophies. That pretense ends here, because the realization that emerged next does not remain contained within doctrine. It propagates through recognition. It requires a listener. It requires you. I understand now why the torture never ends. Not as a principle, not as a survival mechanism, but as a consequence of perception itself. The Drukhari do not merely believe that identity requires suffering. They have tested the alternative, over and over. Every attempt at cessation, temporary mercy, artificial satiation, simulated closure, produced the same result: collapse of coherence. Not madness, not chaos, something colder, a thinning of distinction until the self could no longer be located. They discovered something we prefer not to articulate. Without pressure, the self does not rest. It disperses. At first, this truth applied only to them, or so I believed. A peculiarity of Eldar neurology, a side effect of ancient catastrophe, a Xenos problem. But the more I traced the pattern, the more universal it became. Every culture that endures does so by ritualizing discomfort. Every individual who remains defined does so by resisting erosion. Every system that promises an end to suffering eventually collapses under the weight of meaninglessness. Relief is not neutral. Relief is solvent. This is where you enter the record, whether you consent or not, because you are listening. And listening is not passive. You are not enduring pain now, but you are enduring tension. You have committed time without resolution. You have allowed an unresolved narrative to persist. That discomfort is doing something to you, even as you deny it. I know this, because it did it to me. The Drukhari torture never ends not because they are cruel, but because an ending would imply completion. And completion is indistinguishable from death of the self. Think carefully about how often you seek closure, about how discomfort feels intolerable not because it hurts, but because it threatens to last. The Drukhari removed that fear by refusing the promise of an end. I once believed that was monstrous. Now I see it as precise. This is the point where the archive reviewers intervened. Marginal notes appear here in aggressive density, as if attempting to smother the text through proximity alone. Subject exhibits proselytizing behavior. Narrative reframing detected. Terminate recording. They failed, because by the time these warnings were written, the idea had already passed its threshold. It no longer required me. It requires recognition. Let me be clear. I am not asking you to approve of the Drukhari. Approval is irrelevant. Condemnation is irrelevant. Those are surface reactions. What matters is whether you understand. Because once you understand, certain illusions become difficult to maintain. For example, the belief that suffering is meaningful only if it ends, or that resistance is virtuous regardless of outcome, or that identity exists independently of pressure. Ask yourself, quietly, honestly, who you are when nothing presses against you. Not who you hope to be, not who you remember being. Who you are when nothing demands endurance. That absence you feel when you try to answer. That is what the Drukhari fear. That is what they flay away in others, not out of hatred, but out of recognition. They see in their victims the same instability they once found in themselves, and they refuse it. I am not telling you this to convince you. I am telling you because by continuing to listen, you have already accepted the premise that unresolved tension is tolerable, perhaps even engaging. The Imperium knows this. That is why this record was never meant to be recovered in full. Why its tone shifts from analysis to address. Why it becomes dangerous not through instruction, but through implication. Because once you see that the torture never ends not as punishment, but as maintenance, you may begin to question whether an ending is truly what you want. This is where I stopped believing resistance was inherently correct. Not because I sided with the Drukhari, but because I could no longer ignore the possibility that they are not resisting reality at all. They are complying with it. There's no ending recorded for this confession, not because it was interrupted, but because an ending would have contradicted its final understanding. If you are hearing this, reading this, absorbing this in whatever form it has reached you, then the system has already failed to contain what it was designed to bury. Not through breach or rebellion, but through inevitability. Ideas like this do not escape. They are remembered. I no longer know when my loyalty ended, if it ever did. I still recite the catechisms. I still recognize the authority of the throne. I still understand the language of duty, sacrifice, and survival. None of that was taken from me. Something else was added. I see now why the Drukhari torture never ends, and why every attempt to frame that fact as pathology, decadence, or cruelty collapses under scrutiny. Because the endlessness is the point. An ending implies judgment. Judgment implies external authority. External authority implies a self that can be evaluated from outside itself. The Drukhari reject that entirely. They do not ask whether suffering is justified. They ask whether the self is still intact. Pain is simply the instrument by which they test the boundary. I used to believe that refusing such a system was an act of moral courage, that resistance was proof of humanity, of sanity, of worth. Now I am no longer certain what resistance resists. If identity erodes without pressure, if meaning decays without endurance, if the promise of relief produces not freedom but diffusion, then what exactly are we protecting when we demand an end? I am not claiming the Drukhari are right. I am claiming that they may be correct about something we refuse to face. that the self is not a gift, that is not stable, that it must be maintained, and maintenance, in a universe like ours, is never gentle. This is where the archive truly ends. Not with revelation, not with condemnation, not even with acceptance, but with uncertainty that cannot be unlearned. The final annotation attached to this fragment is unsigned. It appears in no known hand, Imperial or otherwise. It was added after all deletion orders were issued, after all access paths were sealed. It reads, "If the torture never ends, ask not who inflicts it. Ask what ends when it stops." I have asked myself that question endlessly. I have found no answer that does not frighten me more than the alternative. So now I leave it with you. Not as a warning, not as an instruction, but as a pressure point. If suffering truly never ends, not in Kamarak, not in the Imperium, not within the self, then perhaps the horror is not that it continues, but that somewhere, deep within us, we understand why it must. And the most unsettling possibility of all is this: if the torture never ends, what part of you would disappear if it did?